Right, so we begin session three, and here comes the interesting part. We'll talk about various spirits, how they're made, how they're produced, where they come from generally, what are the types, aging, stuff like that. So first of all, we'll start with one that everybody's favorite, really, I think, is vodka. Now, vodka has a very interesting history, as a matter of fact. We'll not go deep into the history because this is actually introduction to spirits. Um, Vodka comes from a word named as called voda. Now, voda in Russian means water. Um, and even to this day in Russia, the word, the water is known as voda. So the story is that back in those days, it was very difficult to find water that was clean, that was, that wouldn't give you stomach troubles, that wouldn't give you infection. And vodka, because it was an alcoholic beverage, it was easier to consume, and you could make sure that it would quench your thirst and at the same time wouldn't give you a bad tummy. And that is how the origin of vodka started. Vodka has its origins in Russia, in Scandinavian countries, in Eastern Europe. All these areas, all these regions produce tons and tons of vodkas. Even now, um, contrary to popular belief, in back in those days, yes, a lot of vodka was being made from potatoes because in these regions you did not have, because these were very cold regions, you see. They were very cold, and not a lot of grains were available, not a lot of fruits were available, things like that were not available to make distilled beverages. So they had to do with what they had, and what they had plenty of was potatoes. So they started making distilled beverages from this raw material. But now things have changed. A lot of vodka is being made from grains. It's a neutral spirit. That means it doesn't have, generally saying, it doesn't have any flavor. It doesn't have any color. It's odorless. And it's a beverage. It's a spirit that can go with anything, as a matter of fact, and it's the most consumed spirit behind the bar. Most of the cocktails have vodka in it because it can take the flavor and aromas of anything that gets mixed with. So a lot of cocktails go with that. You mix it with the juice, you mix it with soft beverages, other alcoholic beverages. So vodka is like the perfect bartender's choice. Um, saying that, as I said, no flavor, no aroma, no color. Fermentation, of course, starts in the same way that every has to happen. First step is fermentation for any and every spirit. If you talk about vodka being made by grains, the grains have to first be soaked and germinated. What that process does, soaking grains and germinating grains, is that grains do not have simple sugars like fruits or fruit juice. They have complex starches which cannot be converted into alcohol by yeast so easily. So first thing you have to do is to make sure that you convert that complex sugar, that starch, into simpler sugar. And how does that happen? That happens when you soak it in water and then you germinate it. As it germinates, the starch converts into simpler sugar. Then you take this, you powder it, and you mix it in hot water, and after that you start your fermentation. So it's something that for grains especially, you cannot start fermentation straight away. You have to convert them into simpler sugars. Once it's converted into simpler sugars, once it's mixed in the hot water, once it's put in something which is called a mash tun, the fermentation can start. Once the fermentation starts, you've got your stuff. You can carry on a distillation. The next step, which is in vodka's case, almost always column still. It is strengthened to almost 90 to 95% ABV, which is then diluted with water and brought down to the required ABV volume, which is generally around 40% or 42% for vodkas. Um, that's pretty much it when you talk about vodka. I mean, it's a very simple beverage to make. It is something that is consumed a lot around the world because it's odorless, it's colorless, it doesn't have any aromas. You mix it with anything. A lot of cocktails are being made that way. Fermentation can happen with grains, can happen with potatoes. In case of potatoes, you still have to cook the potatoes down because you need to convert that starch and then cook the potatoes down, mix it in hot water, and then start the fermentation. So there's a little bit of a difference here when you talk about fermentation in case of grains and vegetables like potatoes vis-a-vis to things like grapes and other fruits. So that's what it is. So very, very important to remember. Vodka comes from the name voda in Russian, I'm sorry. And the origin of this beverage is Scandinavian countries, Russia, Eastern Europe, Poland, stuff like that, places like that. A lot of good quality vodkas are also out in the market now. A lot of flavored vodkas are already also in the market now. Uh, and these vodkas have also come into a bracket where there are high quality vodkas which are in demand for connoisseurs, but that's obviously the best quality raw materials, even at sometimes a little bit of aging. Generally, in case of vodkas, there is no aging required. Is it around 40% ABV, and then it's okay. So let's now move on to tequila. Tequila, must have seen in a lot of movies. We've got, you have tequila shots, and you have some salt, some lime or lemon that we have in the movies. You must have seen a lot of it. But tequila is a lot more than that. Tequila comes from Mexico. As a matter of fact, it comes from a town of tequila, a region around the town of Tequila, and there are 7 certified regions that tequila can be made from. Tequila can only be made from blue agave plant, and you can see that blue agave plant in your on your screen right now. There are various varieties of agave plant. Agave plant is a cactus, which is, again, I said, indigenous to Central America, Latin America, and there are many, many varieties and many subspecies of this agave plant. One of them is blue agave, which is one of the best qualities of agave plants. It produces much sweeter and better quality of product. Now, saying that, you can make a lot of distilled beverages from agave, but you can only make tequila from blue agave, which is the one in the picture here. And as you can see, that huge looking fruit is called a pina. A pina is comes from the word pineapple, and as you can see, it looks like a pineapple. It looks like a huge pineapple. Now, the sugars in the pina are what is the raw material that goes behind making tequila. Uh, these pinas and these plants are harvested after about 5 to 8 years of growth. After 5 to 8 years, they reach a particular point where they have enough sugars, they have enough flavor in them to be harvested, and then to be made use of. So after 5 to 8 years, they're harvested. They are then this big thing that you see on your screen. This is cut into quarters, and then these quarters are cooked. The reason again of cooking these quarters is that we need to convert those complex sugars that there are in this into simpler sugars. So sometimes they're cooked in a big earthen pit that there is in the ground, and then covered with straw, and then let to cook for about 24 to 48 hours. Sometimes they're put in brick ovens. Again, the process remains the same to convert those sugars into simpler sugars. Then these are pressed. Once they come out of this oven, and once they're cooked, they are sort of in you can say straws. So these things need to be pressed now to release that sugary liquid, which will have to be fermented later. So they are sometimes pressed in a machine, in a conveyor belt, where it goes through and the sugar comes out from a different range. Sometimes they're pressed in an apparatus, or you can say, where in all the raw material is put in the middle, and then there is a huge um, boulder which goes in circle with the help of a horse traditionally. Now it's done in machines, and once that happens, the cooked pinas are pressed, and the sugar comes out from a different side. So more or less, the objective is to release those sugars, those important sugars, those sugary liquid now that we need to start the fermentation. The fermentation is started, and um, the product that is made looks sort of like beer, but not completely consumable. This is then fermented, sorry, distilled in column stills twice generally for tequila, which gives you sort of a product which is colorless. Now, colorless comes from the fact that once the distillate comes out, it is generally not colorless. But after that, it has to undergo carbon filtration if you're producing tequila bianco or silver tequila, which is colorless. So generally all the tequilas undergo carbon filtration to remove that color. But then there are different types of vodkas as well. Most of the vodkas, sorry, I'm saying vodka. There are different types of tequilas as well. Most of the tequilas that you come across are Bianco or silver, same thing, which are colorless, and that's a lot that's used in cocktails and stuff like that. Tequila, Bianco, and silver are the the one of the most used beverages behind the bar in cocktails, and tequila is used massively for cocktails. It's one of the most favorite spirits for cocktails, along with vodka and gin. Saying that, there are other types of tequilas as well. Tequila reposado. Reposado is generally aged in oak barrels for about 2 months. That gives it that color, the darker color, the tawny feel, a lot of mouth feel, richer, and obviously because it's been in aged a while, so obviously the prices also go up a little. Tequila anejo. Now, anejo in Spanish means aged, which are aged to about 12 months in oak barrels, much darker, much bolder, fuller bodied. Now, these tequilas are generally had sometimes on its own, or these are the ones that are savored. You don't put them in cocktails, and you don't mass produce them. There's also another kind of vodka. I keep saying vodka. There's also another kind of tequila which is called tequila extra anejo, which is now out in the market. Various producers are producing it, which is aged up to 4 years in oak. So that's even darker, more bolder, tons and tons of flavor in it. So tequila is just not your regular shot with some salt and lime. It's a lot more than that. It's something that you can savor. It's something that you can even keep it in your cellar and age. Okay, so let's move ahead. We move now to brandy. So brandy comes from the Dutch word of brandewijn. Brandewijn basically means burnt wine, means boiled wine, referring to distillation. In distillation, obviously, we just talked about distillation a little while ago. Distillation involves boiling the liquid, and obviously boiling the wine in case of brandy, so that the alcohol evaporates, and distillation continues. So that's the word that has been coined with brandy, brandewijn, burnt wine. It is made from grapes, but it can also be made from various other fruits such as apples and cherries, things like that. And we'll discuss about what different types of brandies are there in the world. But more importantly, the origin of brandy is somehow traced to Middle East, the Arab world. Arabs obviously in their culture had a lot of grapes and raisins and things like that, which indicates the affluency, how affluent they were back then as well. So it is traced there. The distillation process of these grapes started somewhere in the Arab nations, and then it sort of spread around the world and went to Europe as well. For quite a number of years, it stayed pretty modest. The production of brandy stayed pretty modest, and it was around the 14th century, especially in Europe, that it sort of went to a different level altogether. Some really named brandies came, good quality brandies came into play, and they started being exported to the various parts of the world, and that is how the brandy business grew. So the first type of brandy that we generally refer to and that we generally know of is the grape brandy, which of obviously refers to brandies which are made by grapes such as cognac and armagnac. Pomace brandy. To understand pomace brandy, first of all, we need to understand what pomace is. So pomace is the leftover skins, pips, seeds, stuff like that, which has been left over after the wine production process is over. That is the useless stuff which we do not need anymore in the wine production. So sometimes that is used as compost back in the vineyards, or at certain times it is used to make brandy, wherein you take this pomace and you distill the neutral alcohol through this pomace, infusing all the flavors characteristics that the pomace still has. Examples: grappa, which is very famous in Italy, and Marc from France. Third type is fruit brandy. Of course, when we talk about fruit brandy, we're talking about any fruit apart from grapes. Okay. Examples include Calvados. Examples include Slivovitz. Slivovitz is made of plums, and Calvados is made of apples. So these are Kirschwasser. Kirschwasser comes from Germany, and it's distilled off cherries. So these are famous fruit brandies. You take apples, you can ferment it to make cider, you can distill it further to make Calvados. So that is how it works. Similarly, grapes, you can use it to make wine, and then distill and continue the process, distill it to make brandy. Okay, so types of grape brandies. Obviously, the most famous and the most notable one of that is cognac. Cognac is one of the most expensive beverages around the world, one of the most revered, one of the most worshipped beverages that there is around the world. Cognac can only come from the Cognac region of France, which is just above Bordeaux, which is, southeast of, you can say southeast France and northeast, north of Bordeaux. Is distilled twice in pot still, and it is matured in oak casks. Only the best quality grapes are used in making of cognac. You cannot have a cognac made in any other region apart from the cognac region in France. You cannot name it cognac. You can name it any other kind of brandy, but you cannot name it cognac. Cognac can only be named if that brandy comes from the cognac region of France. So all these big the cognac houses are in Cognac only. It's a wonderful place to be, actually. And of course, matured in oak casks, distilled twice in pot still. Remember how I have mentioned that pot stills are generally more associated with higher ends, expensive quality premium products, cognac being one of them. So very special is the kind of cognac which is matured for at least 2 years. Very special old pale, which is also called VSOP, is 4 years. Extra old, which is also known as XO, is 6 years. But what's interesting to understand in this is, although this is the minimum time required to age. Most of the cognac houses extend this by quite a lot. So let's say the minimum requirement by law is 2 years to age. They'll probably be 4 or 5. Let's say the minimum aging for extra old is 4 years, sorry, 6 years. You'll probably find extra old which is 10 years old, because these cognac houses extend the minimum requirement of aging and make the product even better and finer. So three grapes that are generally used in making cognac are Ugni Blanc, Colombard, and Folle Blanche. These grapes are generally not known to produce good quality wines, because you don't need good quality grapes to go for cognac. All you need is neutral quality grapes, the grapes which have neutral characteristics, the grapes which are higher in acidity. That is the kind of grapes you need, and these three grapes do very well. Second kind of grape brandy, again very prestigious, is Armagnac, and as cognac, Armagnac also comes from Armagnac region of southwest France, that is below Cognac. Distilled once in column stills that are called alembic stills. So these alembic stills are a little different from column stills. So you can imagine a mixture or a blend or a contraption which is a little bit of pot still and a little bit of column still. That's what's called an alembic still. And Armagnacs are generally uh, distilled in this. So the other two types of brandies that we have is pomace brandy. Again, as I explained what pomace is, it's the remains of grapes after the juice has been utilized for winemaking, like skin and pulp and seeds and stems. So that's you can see that's what pomace looks like. It's basically, everything that is left after winemaking. So it's not very useful as far as winemaking is concerned after it releases everything that it has, but you can use it for making pomace brandies. Grappa, one of the finest examples of pomace brandies, comes from Italy. Marc, another very famous example, comes from France. Both Grappa and Marc also have aged versions, wherein they are generally colorless, okay, and most common of them are colorless, but there are also aged ones which are just fantastic. Fruit brandies, example again, obviously you can see Calvados, made of apples. Basically, you use apples to ferment into cider, and then you use cider to distill into something which is called Calvados. Calvados is not the only example for fruit brandy. You also have Kirschwasser, which is made of cherries. Same way, you make a fermented beverage out of cherries, then you distill it. Slivovitz is made of plums, generally found in Eastern Europe, quite famous beverage over there, wherein you use plums and then you ferment them to make a fermented liquid out of plums and then distill it, you get Slivovitz. Okay, so now we come to everybody's favorite, whiskey. Okay, so first things first, let's talk about why there are two different spelling, the way whiskey is spelled. So whiskey with Y in the end is generally reserved for Scotland and the rest of the world, as a matter of fact. um, Whiskey with EY comes, generally when we refer to Irish whiskey, so with EY in the end, or American whiskey, EY in the end. So that's how you can differentiate between, these two regions as well. So whiskey comes from the Gaelic word Usage which also means water of life. Gaelic was the language which was being used in Scotland before Scottish, and that's the language where Scottish has the roots. And so Usage meaning water of life. In Scotland and Ireland is where the origin of the whiskey lies, and it was just around 11th 12th century that whiskey really started to being produced in these two areas, Scotland and Ireland. Due to a lot of reasons, barley was a product that was available in abundance in both these areas, in both the regions. Saying that Scotland and Ireland are very different to each other as far as the production process is concerned, Scottish whisky and Irish whisky. The raw materials, although some of them are quite similar, but not all of the raw materials are similar. There's difference in distillation as well, and there is certain differences in nuances and the final product as well. So when you talk about whiskey, generally is now available in almost any and every part of the world, and in fact India is the largest consumer of whiskey in the world. Some of it is not actually whiskey because it's not produced from grains, but whiskey is always produced from grains. Grains can be barley, rye, corn, wheat. Barley generally reserved for Scottish and Irish whiskies because it's available there. And when you talk about American whiskey, you are talking about corn and rye because that is what was available there back when whiskey was being produced. Uh, when the earliest settlers from Europe went to America, they found wild corn growing all over the place. So they started using that as a raw material to make whiskey because barley and other raw materials were not available that well. Um, Different kinds of whiskeys: blended whiskey, Scotch whiskey, Irish whiskey, American whiskey. Blended whiskey, pretty straightforward, just generic whiskey that's out there, made from a mixture of various grains, made from different whiskeys here and there's. Um, just general whiskeys, everyday use, everyday drinking that you get on any wine shop or any liquor shop. Um, Mix, not high end, not premium stuff, just everyday drinking, pouring brands for behind the bar or to be used in cocktails. Okay, so moving on, we now move to different types of whiskey, and of course, we'll have to start with Scotch whiskey first. So obviously, as the name suggests, Scotch whiskey can only be produced in Scotland. Um and more importantly, Scotch whiskey is distilled twice in pot still. This is very important statement. Scotch whiskey is always produced in Scotland and undergoes double distillation in pot still. It is matured in Scotland for at least 3 years. Generally speaking, many producers extend the aging period, but minimum requirement is 3 years. Scotch whiskey, before we talk about different types of Scotch whiskey like single malt, blended, and all that, what is important to learn is that Scotch whiskey is made from barley. It is made from malted barley, for importantly. What malted barley means is that uh, we go back to the fermentation slide wherein we spoke about the fact that grains have starch in them, and that starch needs to be broken down into simpler sugars for the fermentation to take place. So for that to happen, malt barley is first soaked in water and germinated. Once it's germinated, the sugar inside, the starch inside the barley has now converted pretty much into simpler sugar. After that, the malted barley is roasted on floors which are heated up. What this does, it stops the germination process by drawing out the water. Once that is done, it is now you now have malted barley which is germinated but is dry. So it is then pounded into something which is called a powder, something which is sort of a powder, wherein once it's powdered, it's called grist. These are small terminologies which are already in your study guide. When you read it, you will get to know it. But importantly, one needs to remember it is this grist that is then mixed in something called a mash tun with hot water, and is called a mash, which is then need which is the product which is then fermented to produce something which is now called a wort. Okay, WORT. So there are few terminologies here to remember: malted barley, grist, mash tun, and wort. Once the fermentation begins, the fermentation leads the product. The fermented liquid is about 6 to 8% of ABV, and it is this fermented liquid that undergoes double distillation in pot stills, which produces Scotch whiskey. As I said, 3 years mandatory regulation to age Scotch whiskey in oak casks. But generally speaking, you will have scenarios wherein a lot of Scotch whiskies have undergone that aging process for a very long time, more than 3 years in general cases. So, first type of Scotch whiskey, a very famous, very prestigious, high-end premium whiskey, is single malt. It's a product of a single distillery using pot still distillation made by malted barley. The process remains the same. There's germination, there's malting, all of that is there. Difference being that single malt whiskey is a product of single distillery, and the entire raw material, the entire malt comes from that particular distillery. So you are assured that the product is going to be top notch, and all the single malt whiskies that Scotland has, all are extremely good. They're premium products. So all your Glenfiddiches, Glenkinchies, Delvinis, Belvini, Cardu, Lafrior, Lagavulin, Oban, Artberg, Abaloon, all of them, they are just premium products. So the best product is used from one single distillery. That's why it's called single malt Scotch whiskey. Expensive and high in demand, of course. The demand sometimes, in most cases, is more than the produce. And there's blended Scotch whiskey, of course. They are also good products, but they are produced by blending different whiskies and sometimes even neutral grain spirit. It can be from various distilleries as well. It can be a single malt from various distilleries. It can be single malt with some other ingredients, grain spirit as well. So blended, the name is quite self-explanatory. But of course, because it's Scotch, blended Scotch, it needs to be matured in the same way. Minimum aging requirements need to be followed. The process needs to be followed, and these are the bulk of Scotch whiskies in the market. So Chivas Regals, your Ballantines, all of them. So that's two very common and well-known single malt, sorry, Scotch whiskey, the types of Scotch whiskey. Okay, like moving on, we'll move on now to blended malt Scotch whiskey. This is probably my most interesting kind of Scotch whiskey, and I personally like this the most. So these are blends of single malt whiskies from more than one distillery, and of course less common than single malt or blended whiskey. To give you an example, you can see a brand called Monkey Shoulder over there. So Monkey Shoulder is a blended malt Scotch whiskey, but it has a blend of three single malts: Glenfiddich, Belvini, and Kinninvie. So that's what is the meaning of blended malt Scotch whiskey. These are premium products, no doubt about it. These are expensive products, almost at the same price as single malt whiskies, but they have a blend of the best single malts coming from a few distilleries. So that's what single malt Scotch whiskey is. This is definitely something to check out. And then single grain Scotch whiskey, which is distilled from grain or mixture of grains apart from barley. That's single grain Scotch whiskey. Quite uncommon, and it is produced as much. Okay, so now we move on to Irish whiskey, and you can see the spellings have actually changed. So EY for Irish whiskey in the end. As the name suggests, and as was the case in Scotch whiskey, Irish whiskey is produced only in Ireland. Um, Quite similar in lot of things, Irish whiskey and Scotch whiskey, but different also in a few matters. But here's the interesting part. Irish whiskey used to be very famous until the end of the 20th century. It sort of started you know becoming unpopular over the last century, but it has shown a revival in the last 25 years, and more and more distilleries are being set up in Ireland. There was a time in the early 20th century that there were only handful of distilleries in Ireland, and Irish whiskey was about to die its natural death. But the good part is that Irish whiskey is back to being as famous as it earlier was, and the difference being in the fact, the difference being from Scotch whiskey is that in Irish whiskey you can use malted and is generally use malted and unmalted barley. Contrary to that, in Scotch whiskey, you can only use malted barley. The aging factor is pretty much the same. The production process is pretty much the same. Distillation process again is a little different, because in Irish whiskey you have to the distillation undergoes sometimes, not sometimes, undergoes three times. Okay, so it's thrice distilled. malted and malted, barley soaked in the water, germinated, converted to starch, just like it's done in Scotch whiskey. It is then powdered into a grist and then put in a large tank called mash tun for mashing. And then after mashing, it is converted into sweet sugary liquid called the wort. Fermentation happens, distillation happens. Again, the distillation different here from Scotch whiskey that it's distilled thrice, and since it's distilled thrice, it has a lot more. It has a smoother finish to it, and it's not as smoky as a Scotch whiskey is because there isn't much use. There isn't use of peat in Irish whiskey, contrary to what there is in Scotch. Quality ones are distilled in pot, and the others are distilled in column still. Aged for 3 years in oak barrels, so that remains the same. Certain factors are quite similar in Scotch and in Irish whiskey, but there are subtle nuances, subtle changes which make Irish whiskey a little different from Scotch whiskey. One of them being distillation, which is done thrice, and the raw material malted or unmalted. Okay, so single malt Irish whiskey, similar to single malt Scotch whiskey, product of one distillery made from malted barley and distilled in Ireland, matured in oak cask in Ireland for at least 3 years. So there's hardly any difference in single malt Scotch whiskey and single malt Irish whiskey. Single pot still whiskey made from malted and unmalted barley and distilled in pot still within a single distillery. So this is a little different. It's not very common. These kind of whiskeys are generally uncommon outside of Ireland. This has both malted and unmalted barley as a raw material and then distilled in pot still within a single distillery. So as we discussed, malting is obviously a process wherein germination happens and then the grains are roasted, but then there is unmalted barley also that goes as the raw material in this kind of whiskey. Blended Irish whiskey, again the same concept. Blended Scotch whiskey, same combination of whiskeys from various distilleries, a mixture of grains or unmalted malted barley. So blended, self-explanatory. Just as blended Scotch whiskey is there, blended Irish whiskey is there. Most common Irish whiskey, Jameson's, there you go, an example of blended Irish whiskey. These are all triple distilled.